Rumors and leaks have been circulating about possible remakes and re-releases of many of the 3D Mario games for the Switch. Naturally, this sparks conversation about re-releases and remakes of Zelda games as well. As we all know, Zelda has certainly not been neglected as far as remakes and remasters go. We have the 3DS remakes of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, we have the Wii U HD remasters of Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. Of course, there are the DX and enhanced versions of games, such as with Link's Awakening. And then, of course, Zelda receives its first proper from-the-ground-up remake with the Switch release of Link's Awakening. With rumors abound about a Skyward Sword remaster or remake, and a big push by fans to get many of the games ported onto Switch, I thought it would be interesting to give my take on the topic of remakes and remasters as related to Zelda, since you guys vocalized a desire for another Astral Observatory. So I want to talk about what I think about the demand and proliferation of remakes and remasters, whether I think they're worthwhile, and then the thing I have the strongest opinion on, which is how they should be priced. There is no arguing that we live in an era in which remakes and remasters are everywhere. Final Fantasy VII comes out in like a week, we're hot off the heels of the Resident Evil 2 remake and moving on to the remake of number 3. If you can think of a game from your childhood that you enjoy, there is a high chance that a remaster or HD edition has come out. And while I understand why people are frustrated with this, it doesn't bother me personally. It is true that these HD editions often bloat the release charts, and it can sometimes feel like there are more HD editions and remasters than actual new games. But these HD editions and remasters definitely do have their place. Let's take for example the HD edition of Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess is a great game, obviously, but for a lot of its early life, it caught a fairly bad rap. You especially know this to be true if you are an ancient, old, mid-20-something like myself, and remember being on the Zelda boards of the Insider forums around release. People were very negative towards the game, and it was for two main reasons. Number one, people saw the game graphically as sort of muddy and lifeless, and number two, people couldn't stand the motion controls. Of course, we in hindsight can argue that they didn't have to play with motion controls, they could have just bought it for the GameCube. That's how I experienced it for the first time on the GameCube, so there was no issue for me. But you have to understand where people are coming from. The game came out for the Wii in a time when the system was relatively starved of games for people who considered themselves, as much as I hate the term, hardcore gamers. Lots of Nintendo faithful, like myself, bought the system and had to deal with the drought of meaty, fleshed out experiences for non-casual gaming audiences. Even now, I can only think of 10 or so Wii games off the top of my head I consider to be quote-unquote hardcore. So of course when Twilight Princess comes out for both the GameCube and the Wii, people are going to buy it for the new console they spent money on and haven't really had a good experience with yet. This is an example of where a remaster can thrive. The Twilight Princess HD version brought the game to a console that could play it without motion controls, so the people who had a bad experience with the game before can try it again with a regular controller. And sure enough, I know people who bounced off the Wii version of Twilight Princess that have changed their mind on the game completely after playing it for the Wii U. As well, the remake had the opportunity to fix most of the issues people had with the muddy graphics of the original. The HD remake of the game doesn't change the tone or feel of it, but it does enhance the colors, allowing for a wider gradient of dark colors and shades, and letting the intentionally bright and colorful scenes stand out that much more, which not only makes the game far more interesting to look at, but reinforces the thematics of the scenes. Compare the scenes of A Light Spirit Awakening. It's fine in the original, but the remake of it far more effectively emphasizes that the springs and light spirits are spots of hope in a dark world. So the remaster of Twilight Princess solves a very real accessibility issue, while also enhancing the graphics in a way that strengthens the core themes of the game. This is the definition of a justified remaster. This is true of other remasters as well. While the graphics of Wind Waker are fairly evergreen, I think they have aged more than people would like to admit on the GameCube. Don't get me wrong, Wind Waker will still be palatable 50 years from now, in a way that a lot of its contemporaries will not be. But the lighting engine and enhanced colors allow the HD edition of the game to match how I think people remember the original game looking in their heads. So I do think there is a place for remasters and HD editions. Obviously, there are many examples of poor remasters, or remasters that do very little in the way of actually remastering anything. But as a concept, the remaster can go a long way towards bringing the game to new audiences, or addressing issues that ruined it for people the first time. Complete remakes, on the other hand, I am almost always in support of. Certainly some games deserve it more than others, but I generally find them to be virtuous. Personally, I probably play way more old games than I do new ones. In fact, the impetus for me to upgrade my PC was because I wanted to be able to run Medieval 2 Total War at the highest unit count, and my computer just couldn't do it. Being able to play modern games was a nice side bonus. However, a lot of people do struggle to play old games with counterintuitive interfaces, poorly aged graphics, and antiquated gameplay. And I have no bad things to say about people who struggle with those issues. I totally get it. I love comics, but I really struggle with older comics. Each non-event issue having a self-contained story makes it hard for me to want to read the next. I find a lot of the old phrasing and dialogue to come off as cheesy, and I honestly don't get it when people fawn over old comic art. So I totally get it when people say that they have a hard time playing old games. And that's why remakes can be so great. I know a lot of people who have a really hard time with turn-based combat that are super excited for the remake of Final Fantasy VII because they finally get to experience the same story we did, but in a way they can actually enjoy. Even if a remake isn't radically different and more or less just faithfully recreates the gameplay of the original, it can still be a great thing. Link's Awakening is a great example of this. Nothing was wrong with the original game, save some annoying inventory management. Link's Awakening to this day is still a perfectly playable, wonderful game. But the remake is just more enjoyable to me. The original's fairly rigid combat is given a bit more depth and fluidity. The 3D graphics make areas stand out a bit more, which makes navigating temples a bit easier, especially sprawling ones like Eagle Tower. The game is far nicer to look at, and the addition of orchestrated music allows me to visualize what was trying to be portrayed through the original soundtrack quite a bit better. The original Game Over theme didn't stand out that much to me, but with the remake, it's possibly my favorite piece of Zelda music. Just like with remasters and HD editions, bad remakes certainly can exist. I would put forward the mobile versions of all the old Final Fantasy games as prime examples. Or sometimes you get a remake that fans are split on, with the original and the remake each having their pros and cons. The GameCube remake of the original Metal Gear Solid, Twin Snakes, is a good example of this. It is my personal go-to version of the game, but I know many people that can't stand it and exclusively replay the original PlayStation version. I think the fact that we have this choice is great. So while I acknowledge that many remakes and remasters are lazy and annoying and clog up release schedules, I am on record as being very pro remake and remaster. However, what I am not pro is the pricing scheme that almost every one of them gets. The case of pricing for remasters and remakes are different, but they both bother me. For remasters, the idea of charging full price for an old game with higher resolution and a filter slapped over it genuinely bothers me. And yes, this criticism extends to the two Wii U remasters of Zelda. A 5 to 10 year old game with a bloom effect or a new lighting engine is still a 5 to 10 year old game, and it should be priced as such. This doesn't apply in two obvious cases. The first case being when the game has quite a lot of DLC or expansion material that's included in the re-release, or if a substantial amount of new material is created for the re-release. The second situation is if the remaster includes extensive changes to the base game, examples being the 3DS remasters of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask having entirely new game models and 3D functionality. Obviously, creating all new assets takes time, money, and work, and I understand charging full price at that point. However, the vast majority of remasters just up the resolution, slap a filter on, and call it good, then charge full price. Not a fan of that at all. My opinion on the pricing of remakes is a bit more varied. Generally, I think that a top-to-bottom remake of every asset in the game, and often substantial gameplay changes involving hours of coding, justify charging full price. Going back to Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, the game has new assets, new music, re-recorded dialogue, and radical gameplay changes. Despite being a remake of a PS1 game, Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes is a full-fledged AAA experience that was comparable to other games of the time in terms of scope and length, and thus absolutely deserved to be priced fully. More recently, this would apply, in my opinion, to the Final Fantasy VII Remake. The game is so drastically different that it might be more accurate to refer to it as inspired by the first game, rather than calling it a direct remake. Everything is new. Gorgeous new 3D models, heavy retooling of the Final Fantasy XV combat engine, new music, everything. Now I understand that people have issues with the episodic nature of the game, but the first episode is still shaping up to be a AAA game of comparable length to others in the genre, and in my opinion deserves to be full price. Going back to Zelda, Link's Awakening is an example of a game that should not have been full price, which for reference is almost $100 in Canada. I know that's likely to catch me some slack, so let me clarify. I love the Link's Awakening remake. It looks incredible, it controls like butter, the soundtrack is my new go-to for script writing and studying. I utterly adore it. And I do understand that it too required all new assets. But the fact remains that Link's Awakening for the Nintendo Switch is a remake of a handheld game, and it has a handheld game's worth of content. The dungeon creator, and I use that term loosely, is not in-depth enough to warrant full price. In fact, I don't even find it a suitable replacement for the photography missions in Link's Awakening DX. The remake of Link's Awakening could be beat in an afternoon if somebody knew what they were doing. Just stop and think for a second about if you think that Link's Awakening and Breath of the Wild deserve to be the same price. I certainly do not. For reference, this also applies to other handheld remakes on console, like the Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu games or the Mystery Dungeon remakes that just came out. If a handheld remake wants to charge a console game's price, it should add enough additional content to be equivalent to a console game. So, in short, I love remasters and HD editions because they can address problems with the original and make often hard to find games more accessible. I love remakes because they bring exciting diversity in choice and can often inject new life into an aging game, as well as make it enjoyable to entirely new audiences. I do not like how the majority of remakes and remasters are priced, as I do not find their content to be equivalent to other contemporary games of the same price. As an aside, I will give my opinion on which Zelda game needs a remake the most, now that Link's Awakening has been remade. I understand the desire for a Skyward Sword remake, especially by those who are off-put by the motion controls. But I do not think we will ever get a motion control-free Skyward Sword. A Switch remake would simply use Switch motion controls. The game is fundamentally built around motion control, whereas in Twilight Princess they were tacked on and thus easily removable. I think the Zelda game which could use a remake the most is, without a doubt, Zelda 2: Adventure of Link. The game is widely seen as terrible, even by most Zelda fans, and I completely understand why. But I think a remake would be able to address a lot of the jank and NES-era grievances people had with the game, and allow glimpses of the many good qualities it has. The side-scrolling parts of Link's Awakening were sublime, and I think could be easily adapted into an engine for Zelda 2. The game, or games I should say, I'd like to see remade the most are the Oracle games because they're my favorite 2D games. But putting my personal biases aside, Adventure of Link would be the game that most deserves a remake. Thanks for watching another episode of Astral Observatory. How do you feel about remakes? Are you totally tired of them? Do you agree that they're overpriced, or are you always happy to pay full price for games as good as Wind Waker and Twilight Princess? And most importantly, which game in the series would you most like to see be remade or remastered? Let me know in the comments, and if you have anything you'd like to see me talk about in Astral Observatory, let me know that as well. And as always, stay safe out there. It's dangerous to go alone.